but yes, I will try to cover whatever I know and whatever the literature says. So we are going to cover most of the things which are there in the ICH for what the literature is saying, but apart from the surgical management. Okay, so it will primarily be focused on a patient who comes to you in the emergency with intracranial hemorrhage, and we are going to manage that patient in the ICU. So ICH, as we all know, is the most devastating form of stroke and is the leading cause of disability among adults. Just a moment, I'll just silent my phone. My phone is ringing. Just hold on. Sorry. So ICH is the most, I will say, devastating form of stroke and is the leading cause of disability among adults. Traditionally described, it will be traditionally, if I say, if just the slides are not, oh yeah. So traditionally, it has been described as a stroke with the poorest of prognosis. But recent evidence shows that if we actually manage aggressively these forms of strokes, they will have a better clinical outcome. The outcome which is showing in the pictures was, I will say, a decade back. But if you look at the intensive care, the surgical treatment, the treatment for the cerebral edema, it's all going to if it's all going in one line, and you form a protocol to manage ICH in your ICU, the outcomes will definitely be better. And you see more and more patients of poorer form of ICH coming to you in follow-ups, and you are going to remove their tracheostomy tubes, and you feel so good when you see these patients in the long run and follow up. So coming to the definition, I will say spontaneous ICH is defined as a non-traumatic bleeding into the brain parenchyma, which can extend into the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space. If you look at the definition, intraparenchymal bleeding in the absence of trauma or surgery, it is the simplest definition I can define an ICH, and it is the second most common subtype of stroke, accounting for 10 to 15% of the cases. If you look at the risk factor, hypertension is the most obvious risk factor apart from age, history of heavy alcohol, drug intakes, and there are some genetic alleles associated with cerebral amyloid. If you look at the classification, I have not included classification in the presentation, but if you look at the classification of ICH, it can be simply divided into primary and secondary. Secondary with some vascular cause, like some vascular malformation like AVM. And if the primary, in the primary, it is basically because of hypertension or amyloid angiopathy. Okay. You can also classify, people have classified into lobar versus non-lobar ICH, and so on and so forth. Now, if you come to the diagnosis, ICH is nothing but stroke. So if you just define stroke, you can define it as an ischemic stroke or an hemorrhagic stroke. Go towards hemorrhagic stroke, further bisect it into ICH or subarachnoid hemorrhage. Okay, now we are dealing with a hemorrhagic stroke, and that particularly to ICH. But if a patient comes to you in ER, whether you are able to differentiate with it in ischemic stroke on the basis of symptoms, I will say sometimes yes, but most of the time no. So supposingly, if this is a patient who is a 43-year-old male, sudden onset occipital headache, deviation of angle of mouth, altered sensorium comes to you, what will be your diagnosis? So your diagnosis will be that the patient is having a stroke. Now, for a stroke, you diagnose stroke on the clinical manifestations itself. You just need to do a imaging whether it's an hemorrhagic stroke or an ischemic stroke. So before thrombolysis in an ischemic stroke, you go for a CT scan. And when you are going for a CT scan, you are going to know whether this is an hemorrhagic stroke or an ischemic stroke. So depending on the symptoms, sometimes I will say yes, because sometimes ICH will present a severe headache, vomiting, and increase in systolic blood pressure, and no signs of any deficit. So in that clinical scenario, you suspect that there is some kind of subarachnoid hemorrhage or an intracranial hemorrhage is there. Okay. So diagnosis, if you look at these diagnosis, I will say any of the options will be your diagnosis. So ICH diagnosis will be sudden onset new headache. It will be progressive neurological signs. It is not possible to certain whether stroke is hemorrhagic or ischemic based on signs and symptoms alone. And emergent brain imaging is a necessity. Okay. Now come to the commonest site of the strokes. So these are the commonest site of the stroke. So if you look at putamen, I will say basal ganglia, thalamus, subcortical, pons, cerebral, and temporal lobe. But most important thing is they are, if whether it is lower, it is superficial, or it is deep, whether it is supratentorial or it is infratentorial. This is going to make a huge difference in the prognostication of the patients as well. So you should have an algorithm ready in your ER itself for the stroke. So suspected ICH, or I will say a suspected stroke. So you have to activate your stroke code. Your stroke team should be activated. As soon as your stroke team is activated, first thing is check ABC, airway, breathing, and circulation. When it's okay, patient saturation is okay, you take patient emergent to a CT scan. Do a CT scan immediately. And once it is diagnosed that it's an ICH, then the following therapy will take place: that decreasing the blood pressure, whether there is an edema in the scan, whether you need a neurosurgical option or not. So these are the things which actually will follow after the imaging only. That is why imaging is very, very necessary in these patients. So now I will say, if you look at this evidence, how many times you are going to find an evidence like this, that initial monitoring of and management of ICH patient should take place in an intensive care unit or a dedicated stroke unit with physicians and nursing with neuroscience acute care expertise. And despite that, there are so many less neurocritical care unit in India. So we need more specialized unit, more people should be with us who are managing these patients. Only then we are able to have a good outcome in these patients. So if you look at this case scenario now, this is a 77-year-old patient with a history of hypertension. Comes to us with a GCS of E1. We intubated the patient in the ER and response was M2. Presenting blood pressure was 200 by 110. Heart rate was around 68 per minute. And their past history, the patient has a PTCA for which he was on aspirin and clopidogrel. So the patient was on antiplatelets. So EVD was done, which you can actually see in the scan. The EVD is there. So what to do from here? So like in SAH, there is an HNH grading, there is WFNS grading. In ICH, there is an ICH score. Now within ICH score, there are 5 points. If you look at this GCS, so GCS has been given the most importance in the criteria. If you look at the points, 13 to 15, the score is 0. 5 to 12, the score is 1. And less than 5, the point is 2. So if the patient presents to you with a poor GCS, then the prognostication is really, really bad. So GCS, the presenting GCS is an important thing. ICH volume, I will say this is the second most important thing. So if the patient has got a more volume of ICH, I will say particularly more than 30 ml as described in the various literatures, so then most of the time the prognosis is bad. IVH, whether there is an IVH or not, sometimes IVH just complicates each and everything. You put an EVD, EVD gets blocked, then you put a different EVD, then that EVD got infected, meningitis, and each those sort of complications within ventricle full of blood. Age, so age more than 80 has got a poor prognostic sign, and whether the patient has got a supratentorial and infratentorial is also been taken into account. So for prognostication, if the ICH score is more than 2, then certainly you say that the prognosis is not as good. So now, second important point comes to the GCS you have seen in the emergency. Now you need to calculate the volume. So to calculate the volume, you need to select CT slice with largest ICH. So if you look at the film, you just select the slide with a largest ICH just by visual inspection. Okay. So then select the longest axis in which the, if you just select the longest axis, see in this, we just selected the longest axis and then just put a perpendicular to this like this. So A and B is this. Now for the C, you need to know the slices thickness and number of slices in which the bleed is there, and divided by 2, you will get the volume of. So volume can differ whether it is 35 for one, 38 for another, doesn't make a difference. The most important bottom line is you need to know whether the volume is more than critical, that is 30 ml, or not. That's the only subsequent thing which you know, so that you can prognosticate to the family members that the bleed is really, really bad. Now coming to the imaging, see, in the imaging itself, that is CT scan itself, CT scan sometimes show you some signs which can actually prognosticate that the ongoing hemorrhage which is going on in the patient maybe have a poor prognostic sign. If you look at the CT scan image on the right, you can see two different densities. Look at these two different densities. So these two different densities which are there in the scan, they can actually show you that the blood is at a different age. Blood right now is not in the similar age as it has been shown. There are two different densities. So liquid blood, which is secondary to the maybe presence of ongoing hemorrhages going on. And if you look at these images on the left, you see this small island sign. This is known as island signs which are there. So they show that hematoma might be progressing. So next question comes whether we should go for a vascular imaging in the ER itself, like a CT angiography or a digital subtraction angiography. Most commonly, we will say that whether we should go for a CT angiography itself or not in the initial go. See, there are many studies for the spot sign. So spot sign is this. If you look at this image, there's the white dot which is showing in the image is the spot sign, which is you can see that is because of the extravasation of the dye. So if the hematoma is still leaking, you can see that in the CT angiography. And when you see this kind of a thing in CT angiography, you see this, there are many spot signs which are positive. You see this one, this one, this one. So when you see multiple dots, you know that there is multiple hemorrhages going on. So you know that this is a bad prognostic sign in the patient. When you are going to see these kinds of images, you are going to treat the patient more aggressively. But whether you should go for a CT angiography or not, see, if I put it like this, that if the patient comes to you initially, that is within 2 to 3 hours of ictus, if the patient comes to you very initially, and you see that the patient's blood pressure is not stable. Secondly, if you look at CT scan, you see there are some kind of something fishy in the CT scan, you can go for a CT angiography. And if the patient is young, so, and the bleed is not typical of ICH, it can give you additional information whether there is some kind of an AV malformation or not. So routinely, I will say, if the patient comes to you, see, in India, patient doesn't comes to you just in 2-3 hours. Most of the time, patient comes to you going to a primary center, then comes to you within 6 to 8 hours, when at that time the hematoma expansion has already taken place. So it is no point wasting patient's money and putting the patient to a radiation and going for a CT angiography unless and until you think that the patient's bleed is in a territory in which you need a vascular imaging. So most of the time, your CT angiography will do, CT scan will do. But if you suspect that there is an ongoing hemorrhage, patient comes to you early, that's the most important thing, I will say. So apart from all those things, imaging also tells you whether there is a sign of hydrocephalus in the CT scan or not, and whether there is a mass effect or herniation in the scan or not. But so you need EVD like we need in that case. It depends on the scenario if you look at those CT scans. So if you look at the imaging checklist, location of the hematoma, volume, blend sign, spot sign, anything which you seen in the scans, hydrocephalus, mass effect, there is whether there's a mass effect or not, herniation. These are all the things which you need to see in the scans. Now, the most important thing in ICH is the prevention of hematoma expansion. Now, if you look at ICH can be defined into three things. The ictus, which happened right away. So there is an ICH which just happened. Second is hematoma expansion. And third category is prevention, or I will not say prevention, treatment of perilesional edema. So these are the three stages in which you can actually diversify intracranial hemorrhage. So ictus, you don't have a control on it. You don't have a control on the location of location of the ICH. You don't have control in whether on the patient GCS which has actually been happened, but you can control, as the literature says, there are some modalities which you can do to prevent the expansion of the hematoma. So let's see what we can do. So the most important thing is control of blood pressure. Now, as hypertension is the most important cause of ICH, so controlling of blood pressure is pretty obvious. So it comes naturally to you that as soon as you see an ICH, you are going to decrease the blood pressure. But what blood pressure? Till what limit you want to decrease it? What is the problem if you decrease it further than that limit? So these are all the questions which actually been answered in the literature and not answered in the literature. So if you are closely following the literature of ICH, the blood pressure management guidelines of ICH, you might be as confused as I am. But still, we need to have some rational thinking when you are seeing these patients. And if you are following these patients regularly, then you actually can form a guideline in your particular hospital, so that this is the thing, this is how you want to proceed. Now, if you look at the guidelines which are published by AHA and ASA in May 2015, they say if the blood pressure is more than between 150 and 220, you decrease it to 140. And if the blood pressure is more than, systolic blood pressure is more than 220, then it is reasonable to consider aggressive reduction of blood pressure with a continuous intravenous infusion and frequent BP monitoring. So the problem with decrement of blood pressure is hypoperfusion of the area which is around the bleed, okay, around the hematoma. So these guidelines were actually before the ATTACH-2 trials. They have been published after the INTERACT-2, and there is clearly mentioning in that AHA guidelines that the ATTACH-2 trial is going on. So I think a few months after these guidelines, the ATTACH-2 trials actually been published. Now, what's the problem with these two trials? INTERACT-2 trials actually told us that you can decrease the blood pressure to 140 mm of Hg. That is, decrement to 140 mm of Hg is safe. Whether decrement to 140 mm of Hg systolic blood pressure is going to improve the functional outcome, they don't know. So first thing is that ATTACH-2 trial says that the decrement of blood pressure below 140 mm of Hg. So they actually said that intensive lowering of blood pressure is not safe, and INTERACT-2 says intensive lowering is safe. But you need to understand what is intensive for INTERACT-2 is actually standard for ATTACH-2. So INTERACT-2 says that INTERACT-2, the group between the INTERACT-2, the two groups, the blood pressure decrement in the standard group was around 160 mm of Hg, and in the treatment group, the decrease up to 150. But if you look at the ATTACH-2 trial, in the treatment group, the decrease up to 129 mm of Hg, that is below 130, and in the standard treatment group, the decrease up to 141. So if you look at both these trials, so you say that the standard group of ATTACH-2 is 141 and the treatment group of INTERACT-2 is 140. So both these groups actually are saying the similar things, that if you decrease the blood pressure to 140, it's actually being safe. But whether it's improved the functional outcome or not, they don't know. But definitely there is a decrease in mortality in those patients in which the blood pressure is decreased. But when the blood pressure is decreased below 140, the renal complications actually been increased in the ATTACH-2 trials. So ATTACH-2 actually compared intensive versus ultra intensive BP in ICH. Like INTERACT-2, ATTACH-2 actually support the safety of systolic blood pressure lowering to 140 mm of Hg. In addition, ATTACH-2 showed that more aggressive lowering of blood pressure is not of additional benefit. So supposingly, if a patient comes to you, now comes to the practical scenario. See, I don't want to confuse you. See, if you come into a practical situation, if the blood pressure is more than 200, so decrease it to 180, 170, and always see whether there is a urine coming or not. So the patient is passing urine, his kidneys are being perfused well. That's pretty fine with it. But the second important thing which you need to know is whether we can decrease it to any further. Yes, you can, but slowly. Second important thing, if you find that there is a CT spot sign positive in the patient in the initially, or you send the island or a blend sign is positive, then in the few hours, you need to decrease the blood pressure rapidly. And another important point you need to know is that expansion actually take place in first few hours only, 3 hours maximum up to first 24 hours. That has been described in the literature if the patient is not on any antithrombotic drugs. Okay. So, if the patient's blood pressure is less than 200, you can actually safely decrease the blood pressure to 140, depending that the patient's urine is coming. So you can know that the perfusion is pretty okay and patient doesn't have a cardiac comorbidities. So these are the things which you need to keep in your mind. Okay. So second important thing is the medications. So world over, labetalol is the drug of choice. But if you come to the practical scenario, we have all used labetalol, and labetalol is not a strong antihypertensive agent. We have used boluses of labetalol. Sometimes the heart rate decreases further because these patients with the mass effect already have a lower heart rate. So labetalol infusions you might not able to give. Then what to give? So in the literature, Western literature, if you look at the Western literature all over, what you are seeing is nicardipine. Nicardipine infusion has been labeled as a choice, but we don't have nicardipine in our country. So what we can do is we can use nimodipine. So nimodipine, as we are using in SAH, you can use nimodipine with 2.5 milligram per hour to 5 milligram per hour, and then increasing up to 7.5 milligram per hour. But if you are not comfortable with nimodipine, or when you are titrating nimodipine, the blood pressure actually falls too much, which you don't want like that. Then the best thing is start labetalol infusion. Put the patient initially on a low dose NTG. I know that NTG has a problem. NTG can increase the cerebral edema, but at the same time, the patient comes to you in initial 2 to 3 hours, and you strictly want to control the blood pressure. If the patient is on antithrombotics and you are arranging the reversal of those antithrombotics, till that time you need to decrease the blood pressure. So at that time, use NTG, because at that time you are not decreasing the blood pressure, you are causing more harm to the patient. And put a Ryle's tube if there is no contraindication to that. Put a Ryle's tube and start giving oral antihypertensives with the angiotensin 1 receptor antagonist as the first thing, and then you can switch on to clonidine and hydrochlorothiazide and beta blocker, depending on the case scenario which you are facing. So labetalol, no doubt, is the gold standard, is the first choice. Second, nimodipine, if you are comfortable with it. If you're not comfortable with it, add NTG to it, and then so that the dose which you are using with NTG is actually being decreased. So this is how you titrate your drugs. Now, second important thing is, after doing the blood pressure management, is the prevention of hematoma expansion. Now, if the patient is not on antithrombotic, whether giving factor 7 or tranexamic acid is important or not, or you can actually go ahead and give it factor 7 or not. So answer about factor 7 had been given by Spotted and Spotlight trials. Now Spotted was done in USA and Spotlight was done in Canada. They are the parallel studies which were going on at the same time, and they have used 80 microgram of factor 7 over placebo within 6.5 hours of stroke onset. So if you look at the results, so they says that among patients with spot sign positive, ICH treated a median of about 3 hours from the stroke onset. Recombinant factor 7-8 did not significantly improve radiographic or clinical outcomes. So spot sign positive ICH treated within 3 hours, factor 7 is not going to be effective, though the study is only of 69 patients, but still previous studies also like fast trials have not given any positive or equivocal result about factor 7. Now if you look at tranexamic acid, the most recent study which has been published is TICH2 trial, and the TICH2 trial was about tranexamic acid, and the tranexamic acid was given in a dose of 1 gram initially in 10 minutes, and then 1 gram in next 8 hours. Okay, so and the primary outcome was functional status at 90 days. So if you look at the interpretation, functional status 90 days after intracerebral hemorrhage did not differ significantly between patients who received tranexamic acid and those who received placebo, despite a reduction in early deaths and serious adverse events. So fewer patients have hematoma expansion in tranexamic acid group, but it was not statistically significant. Fewer early deaths. were there in tranexamic acid group, that the early deaths were defined in deaths within 7 days. So there were fewer early deaths. No difference at 90 days mortality. That is what they found. That was their primary outcome measures also. And there was no side effect profile. Basically, the thrombotic complications which are associated with tranexamic acid was not there. Now, the fascination with tranexamic acid is because we have found something with CRASH 2 trial. We have find something when the tranexamic acid was used in PPH patients. So it is very obvious. It is very, very cheap. It is easily available, widely available, I will say. So even if there is some positivity in the study, the effect which it will have on the hemorrhagic stroke will be tremendous. But right now, I won't say that we have a positive evidence. But if patient comes early to you, within 2 to 3 hours, to prevent the hematoma expansion, you are seriously thinking that there is some kind of a spot sign positive in that, and you are some kind of a scan which is showing that there can be of bleeding in the scan, then you can actually go for tranexamic acid. There is no problem in giving tranexamic acid. It is completely safe unless and until it is contraindicated by the patient profile. So second important thing is the reversal of antithrombotics. So there is actually no confusion that if the patient is on anticoagulants, the patients needs those anticoagulants needs a reversal. Definitely those anticoagulants needs a reversal. But what kind of reversal agents, what kind of anticoagulants, we are going to see that in the subsequent slides. So first comes to the platelet transfusion. So if you look at, I just put it in a question. If you can leave your answers in the chat group, I will wait for 5 seconds. So platelet transfusion, whether needs to be given in ICH if patient is on antiplatelets. First, yes, in every patient. Second, recommended only if patient is going to be operated. It is not recommended at all. Fourth is to be given only after platelet function testing. So I will see those results in the end, and we'll have a discussion on that as well. But if you look at the trials, if you look at whether antiplatelets actually is increasing the hematoma volume, whether these antiplatelets is actually increasing the size of hematoma, that's actually debatable. And that more debatable is whether you need to give platelet transfusions to prevent that hematoma expansion. Now, the only randomized controlled trial which we are having is the patch trial. Now, patch trial actually says that giving platelet transfusion seems to be inferior to standard care for people taking antiplatelet therapy. They might suffer from thrombotic problems. Okay, so giving platelet transfusion is not recommended unless and until patient is going for a neurosurgical procedure. And mind you, EVD is a neurosurgical procedure. So at least we consider EVD as a neurosurgical procedure. So and patient on antiplatelets going for a neurosurgical procedure, we generally go for platelet transfusion. Now, coming to anticoagulants. So I have already informed that reversal is 100% warranted. There is no confusion like platelet transfusion. You have to reverse the patients who are on anticoagulants to prevent the hematoma expansion. Now, just for the simplicity, I just divided oral anticoagulants into neural anticoagulants and vitamin K dependent anticoagulants. Neural anticoagulants can further be divided into 10A inhibitors or 2A inhibitors, and vitamin K anticoagulants, as we all know, the warfarin is the prototype. So reversal of vitamin K anticoagulants, it's actually our strategy is twofold. So improved regeneration by vitamin K supplementation to make the effect more durable, and then the direct replacement of the depleted coagulation factors. So if you look at warfarin, the strategy is simple. Prothrombin complex concentrate is your agent of choice to reverse the warfarin like coumarin derivatives. Okay, so apart from giving vitamin K, which I have already mentioned, but if you don't have prothrombin complex concentrate, you can switch on and give FFP, as we are all doing it. So why PCC is preferred over FFP? Because PCC is more effective and has a rapid correction of INR, greater increase in clotting factors. It can be infused faster than FFP with less volume. So those patients who are actually having cardiac comorbidities associated with them, you can actually give them with a lesser volume or no volume at all with prothrombin complex concentrate. The only problem with the prothrombin complex concentrate is the price factor, I will say. The price factor is there and thrombotic complications are there, but they are there with the FFP as well. So coming to the dose of prothrombin complex concentrate, if you look at the INR, if the INR is less than 4, 25 units per kg. If it is between 4 to 6, 35 units per kg. If it is more than 6, 50 units per kg of prothrombin complex concentrate can be given. Now coming to the Novax, so we all know that it can be divided into dabigatran, basically 2A inhibitors or anti-10A inhibitors. If you look at the name, every 10A inhibitors has got a XA written in that. So rivaroxaban, apixaban, and doxaban, which we all using, Xarelto and Eliquis. So antidote for 10A inhibitors, that is dabigatran. Antidote for dabigatran is Prexbind or idarosizumab, which we have with us. It is available in India. It is available in India. Let's just switch on its move. Okay. So antidote for dabigatran, idarosizumab. The generic name is Prexbind. It is available in India and it can be given in a dose of 5 gram with 2.5 grams divided into 2 doses. Antidote for 10A inhibitors, Endanexet alpha. It is actually available and FDA approved in US. Presently not available with us. So if you look at the treatment protocol, the first thing is for dabigatran, you need to give Prexbind or idarosizumab. It's kind of a tongue twister, so I generally say Prexbind for dabigatran. And if dabigatran is not available, it's going to take time. So most important with Novax, which you need to know, is when the last dose was taken. So because if the last dose was taken more than 3 to 4 half-lives away, you're pretty safe. So you might not need anything. But if the suppose dabigatran is just been ingested, so or 10A inhibitor has just been ingested, so charcoal has been recommended, but charcoal might cause aspiration. So you need to intubate the patient and give it through RILES 2. If that is the condition of the patient, you can still give. But then if that's not there, you can then also give prothrombin complex concentrate. You can use tranexamic acid as described in the literature and FFP as well. Coming to low molecular weight heparin, so reversal of low molecular weight heparin is also recommended only if it is receiving in a therapeutic dose, not in the prophylactic dose for DVT. So if the patient is receiving low molecular weight heparin or commonly ceftriaxone or Fregmin in therapeutic doses, then we definitely go ahead and reverse them. For enoxaparin administered within past 8 hours, 1 milligram of protamine per every 1 milligram of enoxaparin should be administered. If enoxaparin is given in 8 to 12 hours, 0.5 milligram of protamine per every milligram of enoxaparin should be administered. So coming to the third part, as I've already mentioned in the beginning, that ICH, ictus, then expansion, and the third part is perilesional edema. So there is no need to actually no indication for routine use of osmotic agents for prophylaxis. See, as soon as people see an ICH, as soon as people see something white on the CT scan, they start mannitol and hypertonic saline. If we receive patients from the periphery, the patient is on mannitol from 4 days, 5 days, patient sodium is already being haywire and patient is actually being more debilitated, more bad because of the drugs which he is receiving rather than the ICH which the patient was having. So if you compare both of them, if you ask me what agent is preferable, what is your choice? So I will say, if you look at the literature, there is no preferred choice from both the agents, but still you can prefer hypertonic saline in most of the situation. So if you look at the literature, there is 3 meta-analysis which is compare the effect of hypertonic saline and mannitol, and they have shown greater ICP reduction with hypertonic saline and a lower incidence of treatment failure. Hypertonic saline also reduces the number of treatment failure and it is more rapid and have a sustained ICP reduction. But if you look at practicality in real world practice, the patient's medical history and side effect profile of mannitol and hypertonic saline may be the major factor for choosing an osmotic agent for an individual patient. So for example, patient with congestive heart failure, we should give a bolus of mannitol. whereas continuous infusion of 3% hypertonic saline or a bolus of hypertonic saline can be used in patients with dehydration or decreased urine output or an AKI. Steroid, a big no in ICH. Now, if you come to the management of IVH and hydrocephalus, most of these patients, around 40% of these patients have been complicated by IVH and hydrocephalus. The ventricles are filled with blood. And most of the time when we put an EVD in these patients, this EVD got blocked. We need to flush it most of the time. Then we remove it. Then we put another EVD on the opposite side. So these are the things which are going on with EVD when these patients are on EVD. So there have been trials like Clear 3, Clear IVH trials in which then EVD was put and then a TPA was given. So if you look at the meta-analysis, which has been there are two recent meta-analysis of thrombotic therapy of IVH, which is included, which actually include the Clear 3 data as well. So the first meta-analysis, 17 study found a meaningful mortality benefit and possible functional outcome benefit with different effect sizes depending on the functional outcome scale used. The second, with 6 studies, reported that intraventricular thrombolysis reduced death from any cause by the end of the follow-up, but not the composite endpoint of death and poor functional outcome. If you look at the Clear 3 result as well, they don't support the use of TPA because long-term functional outcome is not increased. The most important thing is that it is safe. They didn't find that there is increased ventriculitis, there is increase of bleeding when they are using TPA intraventricularly. So if you are able to substantially reduce the clot volume, which they are not able to do in most of the study, if you are able to substantially reduce the clot volume to more than 80%, then definitely there is an significant improve in the MRSS scale of those patients. The functional outcome is actually improved if you are able to decrease that to around 80%. So EVD plus intraventricular thrombolysis is safe. It neither increasing ventriculitis nor rebleeding, but was not found to reduce the need for shunt placement. The AHA guideline, which states that intraventricular thrombolysis appears safe while acknowledging the efficacy and safety of this strategy, and this strategy remains uncertain. So they have placed it in class 2B with a level of evidence B. So coming to the surgical things, I'm not going in details into the surgical things. We might have another session completely on the surgical studies. But if you look at the major studies of regarding ICH, the international stitch trial in ICH and subsequent stitch 2 demonstrated no benefit for early hematoma evacuation in patient with supratentorial ICH. For moderate, so you look at this study, MISTY 3, which is the recent study. So in what they do a stereotactic they put a stereotactic guided catheter, and then they give TPA to reduce the hematoma volume. So primarily when the result of this study came, they says that MISTY did not improve the proportion of patients who actually achieve a good response. But if you look at this post hoc analysis and all those things, if they are able to reduce the volume of hematoma to around 15 ml or less, it may be beneficial to those subset of the patients. So whether it is Clear 3, whether it is MISTY, when they are able to reduce that blood, whether it is in ventricle or in the hematoma, they're able to reduce that blood to a substantial volume. In MISTY, they have described it to 15 ml, and in IVH, they have described it to less than 80%. So if they are able to decrease to that volume, definitely the functional outcome of those patients have improved, because these blood and blood products has actually been result in inflammation and increase the cerebral edema component as well. So as there is a problem with supratentorial, whether there is a deep bleed, whether there is a superficial bleed, we need to go early or not. So whether in the deep bleed we should only do a decompressive craniotomy, or we should go and reduce the hematoma volume by doing the minimally invasive surgery, there is no confusion regarding infratentorial portion. If there is an infratentorial bleed, and if it is significant, causing mass effect more than 3 centimeter, it needs to be evacuated. So surgical indications actually are very, very clear in infratentorial or posterior fossa lesion. So coming to DVT profile access, if you look at the Neurocritical Care Society US, they actually says that when your hematoma is stable, that is around 48 hours of hospital admission, when you look at the last CT scan of the patients, your bleed is almost stabilized, you can start unfractionated heparin, or later on start to a low molecular weight heparin for a DVT profile access. And if you look at the AHA guidelines, they also say they take a duration of 1 to 4 days, and the class is class 2B. that you can start. If you look at our institution, we actually wait for 4 days and then start the DVT prophylaxis, the chemical prophylaxis for DVT. If you look at the seizure prophylaxis, the one line which you should know, prophylactic use of anti-seizure drug is not recommended in any form of stroke. It is not recommended unless and until there are clinical seizures. Clinical seizures needs to be treated. So you see, if there is a lower ICH with cortical involvement, you are going to find those patients more having propensity towards seizures. But definitely prophylactic seizure is prophylactic anti-epileptic medication is a big no. So coming to the general care of these patients, see, most of the late or delayed deaths in ICH are because of aspiration pneumonia. So we in our unit usually do an assessment of swallowing by the physiotherapist who are trained in these procedures. Or if there is a problem when the patient is on a tracheostomy and delayed, also we do a endoscopic guided assessment whether the patient is aspirating or not only, and then we'll take a decision to remove the tracheostomy tube. So assessment of swallowing is very essential in these patients. Patients who cannot take solid food have to be on nasogastric or a PEG tubes. Glucose should be monitored. Both hyperglycemia and hypoglycemia should be avoided, and fever should be controlled in these patients. Absolutely, that's no doubt about that. And last but not the least, and looking at all these things, are you going to change your practice of managing stroke patients after this discussion? That we can see in the chat. And we should improve, go for a better outcome after going for a detailed study. Over to you, Prasanna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Saurabh. Thanks a lot. That was a wonderful presentation on intensive care management of ICH. Uh, Basically, I wanted to do it as a class for my DM students, but then we thought when the best expert is available, why not to extend to everyone? So we thought many people will going to be get benefited, and we want to continue this series. So do let us know when is the convenient time for you people, and what all the topics you want. We will be very happy to cover. Thank you, Saurabh, for that excellent this one narrative on this ICH. And we have some experts. Dr. Keshav is available. Dr. Keshav, can you make some comments? You can unmute and make some comments.
And
You can stop sharing the screen, Saurabh, so that we can.
Just hold on.
Yeah.
I'm just stop sharing the screen. Yeah.
Yeah. Now. Yeah.
So if there is any question, you can put in the chat group as well.
Yeah.
We're happy to answer. Dr. Punaya is also there.
Yeah, Dr. Punaya is there. Dr. Keshav? Yes.
Yeah, it was well covered. The basic tenet is again keeping the size and not to expand. So that was well covered, and all the again following the airway breathing and circulation, and then reducing the blood pressure. So everything was well covered by Dr. Saurabh, and this class, of course, will help the trainees.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Keshav. Dr. Keshav is our course coordinator for acute neurocare course, which we have started, which covers all these topics. And Saurabh is one of the important component of our course. We have one more expert available with us, Dr. Punaya from MGM Hospital. Dr. Punaya, can you make some comments on some important aspects of what Dr. Saurabh covered?
Hi.
Hi.
Topics have been covered. One important issue which we will face in the ICU is deciding about the airway management that we enumerated about the tracheostomy.
Yeah.
Saurav, do you use the any scoring system which patient will benefit from early tracheostomy?
Which patient benefit from early tracheostomy? Some scoring system.
Yes.
See, we use ICH score at the very beginning. So if the ICH score is more than 2, specifically if the hematoma volume is too much, and we know that this patient is require a long-term intubation, we do a tracheostomy very early. Also, right-sided bleed or left-sided bleed also make a difference. There is an age is there. There are a lot of factors in that ICH score actually covers that.
Actually,
So
that was exactly my question. What I wanted to ask both of you: when actually do you decide to intubate first? When a patient comes to you, Is it the same criteria what we use for TBI and other patients, or is it Saurabh, Saurabh, you want to
ICH,
take?
ICH or no ICH, the intubation criteria remains to be same.
Same.
So
Okay.
intubation criteria is not going to change for anything. The intubation criteria, the easiest thing, if you think the patient needs an intubation, intubate the patient. Simple as that. So generally, I don't want any kind of a confusion with my residents or my colleagues. In fact, that they should be thinking whether we should go or not. See, sometimes the confusion is there. I will really tell you, the confusion is there because of the thalamic lesion. So thalamic lesion actually behave very, very notoriously. Now, thalamus, you all know, is a relay center. Sometimes the patient is M6, especially with the right-sided thalamic lesion. Patient is M6 one day, and another day he is not able to wake up. He's just lost his consciousness. He was thinking patient was M6, and you intubate the patient, and after 3 or 4 hours, you think the patient is M6. So these are the dicey situations, especially with thalamic lesions. You are seeing those patients with altered consciousness most of the time, but most of the time the decision if you take to intubate these patients also is not wrong, I will say, largely because the aspiration pneumonia is a complication which actually happens in these patients very, very frequently.
Dr. Puneya, what is your take on this? Yeah.
See, intubation, it's a very tricky situation. It's not that straightforward. In straightforward cases, it is fine. Patient who have poor GCS, who cannot, the posterior circulation stroke, posterior circulation hemorrhage, it's straightforward, then we intubate the patient. There are certain patients where they are in a borderline, whether you want to manage them by intubation or without intubation. So usually I err on the side on securing the airway, because for me securing the airway gives a lot of control over his breathing, and hematoma expansion, aspiration is an important risk factor for these patients.
Okay.
And coming to tracheostomy, there is a score called the SET score, and recently they have modified that also. Some trials are going on, and SET 2 criteria or something like that. So based on that, we can have a kind of a judgment by taking which patients will go for an early tracheostomy. But thing is that nobody has the answer world over throughout the world that when to go for an early tracheostomy in these patients. Having said that, ICH means definitely there is some morbidity when the patient is going to recover. So now we need to employ whatever strategies early to improve the outcome of these patients.
Okay. So that is what this, Keshav, Dr. Keshav.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because these patients are already hypertensive because of their blood, and they are also with comorbidities. So while intubating these patients, we are using the induction agents and all this. We have to be very careful because there can be sudden crash. So that will lead to these patients having more harm. So you have to be very titrated in using your drugs.
See, exactly that was my next question in the opposite way. Supposing we decide not to intubate these patients, we want to monitor, and suppose there is a slight amount of this conscious level is not good enough and they are agitated, that itself can lead to increase in the hematoma. Basically, what we are trying to see, what is your take on this, Pune? In a struggling patient, if you don't want to intubate and you want to observe, then how you are going to sedate them? That sedation is one of the most important aspects. How we are going to manage? Yeah.
See, that is what we think. Recently, I saw a paper in which they compared the practices in 2 ICUs. So one ICU was led by anesthesiologist and surgeon. The other ICU was led by a physician. Okay, in the anesthesiology surgical team led ICU, intubation and tracheostomy were liberally used. Were more aggressive measures like controlling the airway also. But in ICUs controlled by physicians, they always went for late tracheostomy, or they waited till the patient deteriorated, then they intubated the patient. But finally, they didn't find a major significant difference in the outcome of these patients on both the ICUs.
Okay.
So if we have the skill set, and it all it's not dependent upon a single factor, person. It all depends upon how your ICU is manned. And one ICU is not equal to other ICU.
Yeah, exactly.
So how your ICU is staffed, whether there is a dedicated 1:1 nursing, whether they can identify early aspiration, whether they can effectively manage a deteriorating airway. So all these things matter. So blanketly we cannot say. See, it's very difficult to standardize ICU into a single one standard. Most of the studies and most of the times we forget this.
Yeah, true.
Okay, so that is the most important factor.
See, Prasanna, one thing I wanted to make it very, very clear. See, most of the expansion actually occurs very, very early.
Yes.
It occurs very, very early. Most of the time when the patient actually reaches to you in the ER, if the ictus has been 3 hours before, as early as 3 hours before, the expansion has already been taken place. So most of the time, if you just extend the window up to 8 hours, as has been done in TICH trial, they are also saying that give those tranexamic acid early. So that is the most important thing. If your patient is agitated, you are seeing the patient after 6 to 8 hours, the agitated patient is not going to increase the hematoma volume largely. It has not been described in any of the studies. It is definitely maybe increasing the blood pressure might be the point, and you are able to control those blood pressures with the oral antihypertensive agent, because Rylstube is in most of the patients as soon as the patient is in the ICU. So you need to titrate those drugs, because at the same time, if you are going to give those anesthetic drugs to those patients, so that's going to be a big problem.
No, this one practical issue, what I want to know for the benefit of all our students, a patient who is not intubated and a patient who is intubated in your ICU. I want you and Punaya, both of you, take this question. What sedation you are going to use and how you are going to use?
See, most of the time, if in my ICU, if the patient is agitated, we start with Serenase, haloperidol. Okay. Most of the time, we start with that. Sometimes a smaller dose of midazolam, sometimes a smaller dose of fentanyl also will do as a rescue sedation. Sometimes most of the time, what I do is, after starting them on Telma or something like that, angiotensin receptor antagonist, we put the patient on clonidine. Clonidine also helps in some kind of a sedation. But after a particular dose, after 3 or 4 doses have already gone in, then clonidine will start. So till that time, the rescue sedation, we use fentanyl or midazolam boluses, but Serenase or haloperidol we use most of the time.
Yes, Dr. Punaya, what do you use?
See, for a non-intubated patient, I use only Serenase. Means, except for that, I don't use midazolam or fentanyl. For example, midazolam, I have been for a long time, I have never touched midazolam in any of these.
Okay.
In intubated patients, it's only analgesic sedation. It's only fentanyl. Okay. So in some cases, may need propofol for other reasons, but it's only with fentanyl. More than 95% of the cases we can manage in intubated.
Okay.
If a patient requires more than Serenase, still very agitated and it's very harmful to the staff. And the thing is that we need to go up on the Serenase dose. Just with 5 milligram and 10 milligram, it will not settle. Sometimes these patients will need even 30 milligrams per day. So with that, most of the patients are controllable. The most important thing in ICH we need to know is that we need to have a very dedicated and written protocol for reversal of antithrombotics.
Yeah.
What happens is now reversal agents are available, and most of the times the private practitioners and the DMOs, they get confused with the brand names. So you have to be familiar with the brand name. For example, the last got a patient actually on Xarelto rivaroxaban, but the referring doctor thought it was Pradaxa, that is dabigatran, and he managed to get the antidote also, the idarucizumab. Okay, so the patient came with the antidote to my ER and asked to give the antidote. Then when I saw the prescription, it was Xarelto. Actually, it was rivaroxaban. For rivaroxaban, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
Then we gave 4-factor prothrombin complex concentrate, Octaplex. So Octaplex should be in your formulary. Your pharmacy should have Octaplex, at least 2,500 units, that is 5 vials. And idarucizumab, in each city, one vendor, okay, one pharmacist will be having idarucizumab. Okay, so we need to have access to that, because more and more patients are being prescribed with these drugs. We need to understand that this is the prescription from the cardiologist for non-valvular AF and other, even for DVT prophylaxis, it's been prescribed right and left by the orthopedicians. So it's been used very commonly, and our students, residents, everybody has to be familiar with that. 4-factor prothrombin complex concentrate and this antidote this adnext alpha, I think we are not.
It is not available.
We're
Not
not-
available. Not yet available in India. No, if PCC is not available, FFP, do you advocate?
See, FFP can be given, but practically, see, by the time you get the FFP and give, already the hematoma expansion must have happened.
Okay.
And you need to give in very large volume. But now there is no reason to say that PTCC is not available. PTCC should be available in any hospital, because if you see the cost analysis also, it's the dose to dose, it's almost equivalent to FFP.
Yeah, true.
Okay. And most importantly, it can be easily given, just like Lasix, it can be pushed.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Just we need to take the little bit of effort to make it available in our formulary, and now how quickly you can get it from your formulary.
Okay, good. There is one question from one of our residents who is doing DNB in neuroanesthesia in Global, Karthik. Some of the, what he asks is, sir, some of the patients with blood in the ventricles have fever in spite of sepsis being ruled out. What all different modalities do we have to treat them other than paracetamol and sponging? Saurabh, you want to take that?
That's actually a difficult question.
Yeah.
It depends on what is available in your ICUs. So other than those sponging and those measures, if the patient doesn't have an ICH, so in those scenarios, I have used Dynapar infusions. I have used NSAID infusions, and we are continuously using that as well. So most of the time when ICH is having a fever, not at the initial onset, it generally being started on after 48 hours to 72 hours. Most of the time the trend is like that. Only then the fever is actually start, the inflammatory markers are inside the system, and then they start. Then we just rule out all the things for the sepsis. And in my unit, once the hematoma is stabilized, we are still using the cheapest option, that is diclofenac sodium, and that's we are using right now, and we find it quite effective. As soon as we see that there is no infective marker, we are actually using it, though the literature is very thin about it. I will say the literature is very thin about it, but we found it the most practical solution which we are using.
Yes, Dr. Punaya? Yeah.
See, fever is very common after IVH. Okay. Problem is that in the question itself, he has sent after sepsis has been ruled out. You should not just rule out sepsis just because patient has got fever. See, when you initiate the protocol for sepsis, there's enormous costs involved in that. You draw blood culture, you give antibiotics and things like that. Fever only should not initiate you to work up sepsis, because this IVH causing fever is a known thing, and it will cause fever in almost all the patients. So how effectively we can control that fever? We need to settle down for a temperature around 38 and not more than 39. So that should be our target. We should not aim for a temperature of 36.6, which is never going to happen. And most importantly, previously I was using this sponging a lot, but now I have stopped it completely, because invariably sponging will produce shivering in these patients. Use anti-shivering medication. Shivering again will raise the temperature, and it will be a vicious cycle. So Dynapar infusion, yes, it's a good option. Round the clock paracetamol, the maximum dose paracetamol as tolerated by the patient, and then just leave it, because it has been found that normal compare with aggressive temperature control measures and normal temperature control measures, there is no significant difference in the outcome of this patient. The temperature will automatically settle down after the first week or the second week. Stipid sponging, use it very cautiously, because it produces a lot of shivering. Use magnesium sulfate very liberally. You can go up to 6 grams per day also. So that will also will act to control your temperature. You can ask Dynapar infusion, but be careful about the renal function. The patient has slightly elevated creat or something, just try to avoid that. But don't jump your guns to initiate the sepsis protocol, because I have seen most of the times when the surgeons come for round, they just write all the cultures on seeing the temperature. Don't do that. Only if the patient has got other sepsis features. Patient has got tachypnea, or the patient has got hypotension. See, hypotension in this case may not be systolic blood pressure less than 100. Okay, these patients are usually hypertensive. Okay, so even 110 may be hypotensive for this patient, or a rise in creatinine, Only in those situations, initiate the sepsis workup and sepsis culture. Otherwise, just for fever, do not draw blood cultures, do not draw CSF cultures, and just like that.
But one thing I will say that diclofenac infusion, if people have not used it, please use it. I have seen it. It is very, very good practical solution. Only one ampule has been used in a day. Okay. So most of the time, if the patient has not a very, very bad renal functions, you are able to do a well controlled fever, because with the fever, na, it's the general well-being of everybody in the ICU. Sir, patient ko fever hai. Okay, if attendants come, हमारे patient को fever हो रहा है. If you monitoring a continuous temperature, there is a tachycardia associated with fever. There is a blood pressure which is uncontrolled with the fever. So most of the time, you are finding associate factors which are associated with the fever. We inside know that it is not going to come much harm to the patient if the temperature is not above 38 degrees Celsius. But at the same time, if you are able to control it, yes, paracetamol in the full dose and use diclofenac infusion. It's just for a bolus dose of diclofenac, and then one ampule diluted in 50 ml starts at around 0.04 milligram per kg per hour. That is comes out to 2.5 to 3 ml per hour, and then it's continued for a day. So it's very less dose.
Okay. How do you actually, Dr. Punaya, decide on nutrition of these patients? When do you start actually practically, like when the patient comes?
See, if the patient is not intubated, and it all depends on the severity of the ICH. So some of the ICH patients, they might be talking, the swallow will be okay. So straight away after admission, after 2-3 hours, you can start giving oral liquids and oral diet, you can start. But some patients, the swallow may not be okay, so they go in for rice tube feeding. And rice tube feeding can be initiated within 24 hours also. There is no harm in initiating rice tube feeding. Enteral feeding should be initiated as quickly as possible. And without saying intubated patients also, early feeding is always preferred. So by day 2 or day 3, you need to achieve the full calories as well as the full protein supplement for these patients.
Okay. Dr. Saurabh?
Yeah, exactly the same.
Do you do the testing for dysphagia or something, swallowing difficulty, or just put some amount of
No. We routinely document.
Okay.
We routinely document in these patients.
Do you do fluorescence testing or what, or fiber optic?
It depends. So most of the time, our physiology team do the Gauss testing, and they actually document in their form that whether the aspiration is there or not. They use those custard with those dyes, and they do a full testing with their stethoscope and everything. And if the patient requires to do for a fees, or we'll say the endoscopic thing, we refer the patient to the endoscopy team. And sometimes we do it ourselves when they are not available. Right now we are doing it ourselves, and ENT team is not coming, so we are putting a fibroscope, giving the patient a custard, and then seeing where it is going actually. So it's not a difficult thing to do. So it can be done very easily and should be done. I will say should be done. Swallowing assessment should be done in these patients.
Okay. Dr. Punaya, you want to comment on that, or same? It is same essentially.
See, swallowing assessment, yes, there are various ways to do that. The thing is that a simple clinical swallow assessment, the bedside trial is what is mostly practiced, and it's mostly practically possible. Okay. So only in certain cases when we decide to decannulate and get the patient out, then we'll go for advanced testing. Otherwise, a simple bedside swallow test is what is usually done. A nurse controlled and a speech therapist controlled test is being.
Okay. So this, are you still not sure about using tranexamic acid? It is out, Saurabh?
No, I'm not saying it is out.
Yeah.
I'm not saying out. See,
if the patient comes too early, like very early, yeah.
So I'm not saying it is out. See, in the TICH2 trial, they have used the window up to 8 hours. Okay. I have already told that up to 8 hours, most of the expansion has already been occurred. Okay. It is widely available. It is cheap. And the TICH2 trial has shown that it is safe. Okay. They have used it in more than 1,000 patients. CRASH2 trial also has shown that it is safe in traumatic brain injury patients.
Wow,
so
yeah,
the safety profile has largely been tested for tranexamic acid. Now, only problem is whether it is effective or not. So the functional outcome, as we have already seen with the things, the functional outcome, they didn't able to find that improvement in the functional outcome in the study. But if you look at all other parameters, they are finding that it's positive for reducing early mortality. They are saying that the hematoma volume is decreased, but it's not statistically significant. So definitely you can give if your patient comes early to you. If the patient comes within 3 hours to me, I will definitely give it a try. Definitely.
Dr. Punaya, any higher dose than this? 1 gram and then 1 gram infusion, like in a, maybe around 20-30 milligram per kg, something like that?
See, we don't use very high doses actually to say. See, when we give the routine dose, if it works, it works. Because you know about the studies about tranexamic acid, sometimes it comes with a bang saying that it works very well, but most of the times there's no difference in the significant outcome of these patients. So I don't believe in these magic bullets. So what is more important is these patients who require the nursing care, and most importantly for the long-term outcome of these patients, most of the time we forget the rehabilitation. That is very, very important. So the rehabilitation should be available to all the patients, even after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, like that. Otherwise, this ICH produces very devastating morbidity. Okay. Even after 6 months, they may be left with some kind of deformities or morbidities. So it's all I stress more importance on the systems of care. So all these things, tranexamic acid and other things, it will be there. But it's none of these things are golden bullets or magic bullets. We need to
yeah, the overall core, this overall care is going to matter for the outcome of these patients. True.
Yes.
Yeah. This
no, one question I would like to ask everybody. See, these patients sometimes they'll be bedridden even after discharge. Okay.
Yeah.
So when we discuss about DVT prophylaxis, we say that within 48 hours, if there is no coagulopathy, if the clot is stabilized, no expansion, we start low molecular weight heparin. So what is the plan for DVT prophylaxis after 1 week, say 2 weeks, after 3 weeks?
Yes, Saurabh.
So in these patients, we generally discharge the patients on low molecular weight heparin itself. See, we are not discharging patients on Novax, not at all. Because these patients actually been receiving, if the patient is so debilitated, most of the time the patient is receiving feeding through a PEG tube or a Rice tube at the time of discharge. Okay. So giving a subcutaneous heparin like an insulin is very easy. And it is safe and recommended in the literature. A long studies have been shown with that those outcomes in those outcome studies as well. So we prefer to give subcutaneous low molecular weight heparin only.
How long? For how long?
How long? No answer.
It is
so this is important question which we don't have a very solid answer.
Very solid answer is not.
Bedridden for few months, and we don't know how long to be continued. So most of my patients are also in fragment DVT prophylaxis for long time, because with that we have not found any rebleeding. Initially, when we tried to use oral anticoagulation, there were very significant rebleeding risk. So it's a most important thing. And the other questions which may be an extension of this discussion to be answered are, if a patient is on antiplatelets for atrial, for whatever reason, for a stent or something, who developed an ICH, when to resume antiplatelets? The second question is, if the patient is on anticoagulants, we have reversed the anticoagulation, but the patient was on an anticoagulation for a particular reason. The reason being maybe a non-valvular atrial fibrillation. The reason being maybe a valvular heart disease where he has undergone a valve replacement, or in worst scenario, the patient must be having an LVAD. I had a patient who was on LVAD device where I had to give a PTCC and reverse the patient. So when to resume anticoagulation in these patients? So that is also a question. So these are all the questions which we don't have a very solid answer, but we can resume anticoagulation because these patients will need anticoagulation for a purpose. Otherwise, his heart is going to stop. His LVAD is not going to function.
Yes.
So it is better to start with a low molecular weight heparin, because as we all know, it is very safe and easy to administer. With heparin, with conventional heparin, unfractionated heparin, always there is a problem, because it's very difficult to titrate the range in which we want to maintain the therapeutic range, in which we want to maintain the anticoagulation. And oral warfarin is also a problem, because the monitoring and the different laboratories will have different ways of reporting that. So it's there also we try to use low molecular heparin. So these are the two things. But if the patient was on aspirins for primary prophylaxis, please do not resume aspirin, because as such also primary prophylaxis aspirin is not going to help.
Yeah, true. That is true. So having said that, this one more question what was in my mind was, when do you actually decide for surgery? Like when to take this patient for surgery? And if we take for surgery, whether you just do a decompressive craniectomy minimally and come out, or you want to decompress that hematoma and come out, which is better, Saurabh? What do you
See,
feel?
when to do timing of the surgery. So if you look at SIG2 trial, they have shown that going ultra early for surgery is not very effective. So most of the time, I am sure the protocol which has been used in institution is when your patient deteriorates, and deterioration itself is not standardized. The patient is M6 going to M5 is deterioration, or if the patient is M6 and now have become M6 drowsy is deterioration. So how early you want to pick up that deterioration? So the decision generally is based on the CT scan, the repeat, and the clinical deterioration. Most of the time, the timing of the surgery is like that. And if you ask me what is better, so if you look at those minimally invasive surgery, these mystery trials are showing that if you are able to reduce that hematoma volume to less than 15 ml, so the functional outcome has not been improved, as I have informed. But if you look at the corollary, the post-hoc analysis of those studies, they are saying if you are able to reduce the hematoma volume to less than 15 ml, definitely you are going to see more and more functional improvement in these patients. So putting a
Okay.
catheter there and putting TPA for 9 doses has been done in MISTI trial for the hematoma reduction. You can do. We are asking our surgeons. Our surgeons are ready with the protocol, but with this this extended lockdown and extended COVID, we are not able to do it. We were actually been ready with our protocol. Presently, with a deep bleed coming, we are doing a decompressive craniotomy. If the bleed is superficial, we try to remove as much as hematoma as possible. We are removing hematoma. Hematoma removal is beneficial. Definitely, it is beneficial. As you are able to decrease the hematoma volume, it is definitely beneficial if you are able to do it safely.
Punaya, reducing the volume versus decompressive craniectomy.
See, decompressive craniectomy is for specific indication, isn't it? They're all based on the CT scan finding. Okay, so only reducing the hematoma volume and putting the bone back, means although so many trials are happening again and again, including the minimally invasive surgeries and reducing the hematoma volume. Also, some trials have advocated putting a catheter inside the hematoma cavity and instilling thrombolytics. Also for IVH, also that has been routinely used to decrease the hematoma burden and with theories. But if you can see, if you attended so many conferences, people will be showing with intervention, pre-scan, post-scan, and without intervention also pre-scan and post-scan, the hematoma must have been resolved. So this is a question where we don't have a very, very strong evidence-based answer for that. But definitely by reducing the hematoma volume, what we think is that we can come down on the ICU days, the ventilated days, and the length of hospital stay. So that is the presumed advantage that what we think. But we need to now await on more data to confirmly say that this is going to work. But having said that, any volume greater than 50 cc, we are going to subject them for surgery and then try to reduce the hematoma as much as possible.
Okay, that is true. So any more questions from the audience? Dr. Keshav, do you want to make any more comments? Yeah, please.
I think it's all covered. But just I wanted to say, as we all are the trainees, so regarding fever in the ICU should be controlled. In many studies also it has been found that fever has to be controlled in all the acute brain injury patients. So it can be like the blood is there inside, like IVH and ICH we were talking about. So more the blood, more chances of the central fever and other the non-infectious fever in the neuro ICU. They are also common. So we can think in those terms as well.
Okay. Okay. Rajshri madam, I think Rashmi madam is there. You want to make some comments, madam? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, madam. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what is the role of anti-epileptics or EEG monitoring post if the patient is not improving? Would you advise EEG and see if there's some subclinical seizures? Yeah.
So, ma'am, if you look at any subset of brain injury, if radiological scans are not meeting with your clinical scenario, so if you think your patient must be better looking at your radiological scan, you should go for an EEG monitor. Okay, that's a simplest and the basic answer to all the intracranial lesion, whether it is an SAH, whether it's an ICH, whether it's a it's an ischemic infarct, whether it's a brain tumor. If you think that your patient should be better, why is not waking up, the scan is good, everything is good, then you should go for an EEG monitoring, definitely. But a routine and prophylactic role of anti-epileptic medications, though the evidence is very, very thin, it's class 3 still, but and it's against, we don't use it. We don't use it in any form of stroke, apart from SAH, short period of time.
Okay. Thank you.
How much the duration of EEG, Dr. Saurabh, in your protocol? How much duration of EEG you are doing in such
So
patients?
generally with the paucity of the EEG machine, we use a 24 hours. Basically, in overnight we put a EEG machine in the night to the patient, and for an overnight, we generally do an overnight EEG. But ideally, a 24-hour EEG should be done. As long as, see, jitna long karoge, how you prolong those duration, you are going to find something. So if you are able to do it more than 24 hours, it's very good. But we generally do it overnight because of the machine constraint sometimes.
I think can you use this multi-parameter monitor with EEG capacity? Some 8 channels they are coming. Is 8 channel is enough, or you want to do a full-fledged EEG?
If it is available, why not do it?
8 channels is enough, Punaya?
Not enough, but
not enough.
Always a full lead ECG gives better information.
Okay.
But for a point of care thing, if you want to use it, if you are then you can use that.
Because now a lot of monitors are coming with the EEG modules. For example, that Neon Codan and the GE, they are coming with the EEG modules of 8 channels. So we can use that and try to see, because if it is so clinically relevant that clinically the patient is different and scan wise is different, then at least in that 8 channel you should be able to make out at least NCSC if you are anticipating that.
See, the catch here is disproportion between the clinical finding and the radiological finding. For example, you see a small hemorrhage in the thalamic hemorrhage, and the patient is disproportionately comatose, then we have to suspect a non-convulsive status epilepticus and do an EEG right away.
Okay.
So if you are, if you know that for a huge hemorrhage or the brainstem involvement and things like that, patient is comatose, you know that. In that case, you may not go for an EEG, continuous EEG monitor.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saurabh, Dr. Punaya, and Dr. Keshav, and Dr. Rashri for the active participation. It was one of the excellent class I attended in the recent times. And soon we'll be coming with the next topic. Dr. Saurabh has agreed to conduct one more class on subarachnoid hemorrhage. Maybe in the next week, I'll share the details with you. And after that, for a few more topics on neurocritical care, we'll try to drag it. Dr. Punaya, though he is very busy with his hectic schedules, we'll try to drag him into at least into the discussion part. And some of the PGs can present on that. Thank you very much. And we will end the meeting here and we can finish off. And I have done the recording of this meeting. Anybody?
That's what is important.
Yeah, I have done the recording, full recording, including the discussion. Anybody who wants can mail me at drprasannabidkar@gmail.com. I can share it with Google Drive. It's a big file. I will try to share with everyone so that it can be used in future if anybody wants it. Thank you. Thank you very much. You can leave the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saurabh again and Dr. Punaya for joining.